Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in round 6 of our coverage, the 2017 U.S. Chess Championships. Our competitors, white is played by Fabiano Caruana, the third-ranked player in the world, also the reigning champion of the U.S. Chess Championships. He put in a dominant display last year. His opponent is going to be played by Gata Kamsky. He's had kind of a rough start to the tournament. Has had 1 win, 2 losses, 2 draws. He's going to be looking to get back on track. Fabiano, he's tied all of his games, so he needs a victory to start climbing up the leaderboard as well. But so far we have Caruana with 2.5 points, facing Gata Kamsky with 2 points. White starts out with pawn to e4, pawn c5, Sicilian defense. We haven't seen too much Sicilian defense in this tournament so far. Knight f3, knight c6, pawn d4, main line of the Sicilian, but then knight to f6, and after knight c3 we see pawn e5, variation that we don't see all too often. Usually we see more of the Najdorf defense, maybe the dragon or accelerated dragon. I don't see as much of this, the Lasker Pelican variation. It's somewhat interesting. It leaves this pawn backwards, not usually something you see in the Sicilian defense, and it also leaves the square here on d5 a little bit unprotected, which we don't see too much in the Sicilian defense. Usually going to be playing pawn to e6 at some point, but e5 is the play. And then knight to b5. And if you guys want, if you watch this video and you say, yeah, this would be a really cool opening to go over, feel free to leave comments below, or you can always email me. That's where I get a lot of the feedback for videos I make, thechesswebsite@gmail.com. We can do an in-depth video on this specific variation in the Sicilian defense. But knight to b5 is thought to be the best move. It's very easy for black to equalize in any other move that white does. But this threatens knight to d6. And so usually black is going to play pawn to d6. If he does not, and does not allow his queen to kind of protect that, if we see maybe pawn to a6, then knight to d6, we see the bishop take, queen up here to d6, all of a sudden white has the double bishop pair, and it just has a very aggressive board presence right here. He can later get the star square bishop involved into the game, castle on the queen side if he wants to. Going to have a really good game from here. So black is almost forced to play this pawn to d6, and then bishop to g5, getting it involved into the game. And then pawn a6 is kind of where theory is at on this variation right now, forcing this knight to come back. Doesn't really have any moves except for knight to a3. So that's kind of some of the compensation that black has in this opening, is forcing one of white's knights over here on a3, which it's not doing anything. It's going to take a few moves to really get involved into the action. And then pawn to b5. For the longest time, it was thought that getting your bishop involved into the game here was probably the best move. But instead of the bishop coming in, it's now pawn to b5, getting ready to fork with pawn to b4. And so we do see an exchange here on f6, and then white's going to be looking to move one of his knights. Now black has 2 options. It could be to take with his queen or take with his pawn. And you may look at this and say, well, I definitely would rather take with my queen because I don't want to have double pawns here on the f-file, and then I have nowhere really to castle, safely at least. But the problem is if you take with your queen right here, then the knight comes up to d5. Nice square outpost for this knight right here, forcing the queen to move. Queen back here to d8. Not a lot of other great squares for the queen to go to. Pawn up to c4, also protecting, breaking up this pawn right here. And then if we see the pawn to, let's say, b4, then queen to a4 gets a little bit tricky, pins down this knight right here, also attacking the pawn here on a6. We see bishop to d7, knight up here to b5, and this is kind of that critical square right here where the pawn can't take, but he doesn't have a lot of great moves, so pawn takes, queen takes up here on a8, queen takes here on a8, there's a fork, and then the queen falls, and this knight's going to be able to come back to b6. We did go through a lot of those moves very quickly, but that's kind of where the theory is at so far in this variation. My guess is both players have not studied, maybe Gata Kamsky, since he did play pawn to e5, but my guess is they haven't gone too far down that rabbit hole to see if there's other lines in that variation they could play. So Gata Kamsky went with more of the traditional approach, and that's just to take with his pawn here on f6, and then see if he can equalize, maybe open up in the center of the board, play pawn to f5, and try to get some momentum, because right now He's got a weakened king side. It's not really looking like he's going to castle on the queen side. He does have a double bishop pair, and his opponent has a knight here on a3, but I don't necessarily like his setup right now. Fabiano continues with knight to d5, and black has to realize that he needs to get rid of this knight here on d5. It is putting a ton of pressure on him. It's a great outpost and doesn't have tons of great options to go ahead and remove this. He would like to just play knight to e7 because it kind of threatens. White's forced to do something, but right now he's almost forced to just play knight takes on f6, and that's checkmate. So that's going to be bad. You usually don't want to force your opponent to checkmate you. So instead, he plays bishop to g7. This does protect the pawn, and it allows the knight to come here to e7. So that's exactly what he does. Bishop to g7, bishop to d3, knight e7, kind of forcing the exchange here. So that knight does come off the square here on d5. Black still does have the backward pawn on d6. Pawn to c3, allowing for the knight to come back here to c2, get involved, because right now on a3, it's not doing a whole heck of a lot right now. Pawn to f5, just trying to break up the king side of the board. He does have double pawns here, so he needs to be a little bit more aggressive. His opponent's usually not going to take here on f5. He's not going to recapture right away. We could play pawn to e4, now forcing the bishop to move. If maybe bishop to e2, then you could see something around castling on the king side, maybe queen to d2. We'll kind of go through these. And then if you wanted to take here bishop on f5, you definitely could. But if we come back, instead of taking on f5, which you usually don't do, you end up losing somewhat of a tempo by, taking this, and they just recapture, get a developed piece, which right now they don't have. Instead, decided to go and play knight to c2. So Fabiano wants to get that knight involved into the action. And then pawn to f4. So trying to gain a little space, trying to do something on board is Gata Kamsky, but it's very tough right now. He has double bishop pair, but bishops really do well when the board is open. There's not a lot of clutter in the center of the board, and his pawns are actually doing a lot of that cluttering right now. So he needs to start to break things up and really start to control a lot of the board, which he's not doing right now. Fabiano, queen to h5, says, hey, if you're going to try to block me in a little bit and try to put a lot of pressure, I'm going to start getting more of my pieces involved into the action, knowing that you have a weakened king side. Get my most powerful pieces on board and see if I can wreck shop on your side of the board. Pawn to h6, knight up here to b4. Getting ready to come back to the square on d5, which we've already talked about, also allows him to come up to c6 and put pressure on the queen side of the board. And bishop to e6 is very, very interesting. I'm not sure that Gata Kamsky actually saw the pressure that was on board. And Fabiano actually has a really nice decoy. And if you want to pause and see if you could find the best move, but the best move, and he found it, is actually just knight takes on a6. The rook can't capture here on a6. I mean, in theory he could, but then he's just going to lose to bishop to b5. Check, the rook is going to fall. So he does end up losing material right there. Castle's on the king side, which is risky in and of itself, but it's no more riskier than just keeping your king in the center of the board. Now the knight can just come back to b4. So free pawn for Fabiano. His setup's better. His pawn structure is a little bit better. So all in all, Fabiano is kind of having his way in this game. Now Kamsky looked at the board and after a while played pawn to f5. And f5 to me is kind of that like Hail Mary. I think a lot of this stems from how he's played the tournament so far, having 2 losses, recognizing that he's in a bad spot and he needs a miracle to happen. And so I think that's kind of what f5 is. You could play a lot more conservative than f5. You could play just queen to d7, make your opponent work for it, castle on the king side. But f7 kind of just puts himself that we're just going to blow up the king side of the board, see if my opponent can make a mistake. So we see castle is some protection right there. Pawn takes on e4. We see the bishop recapture. Rook over here to c8. This is semi-open file that he can try to get involved into the action, but it's not real clear how he's actually going to get past Fabiano's line. Rook to d1, also controlling a semi-open file. Both of these sides recognizing they need to get their rooks involved into the game. Rook down here to c4, attacking the bishop, and then queen here to g6. A little more aggressive square, also defending this bishop on e4. Gata Kamsky says, you know what? I'm going to just convince myself that rooks are the same as bishops, and I'm going to go ahead and take here. Queen recaptures. I think that is a terrible trade. And then pawn to f3. Knight to d5, attacking the queen. Not really going to see the bishop take, because then queen takes here, check, and then, Fabiano, if he could exchange all the material down on board, that'd be great for him, because he would have a very easy endgame. So Gata Kamsky can't really start to exchange on board, so he decides to play down queen to g5. Very easy to defend against that pawn here to g3. Rook f7. And then king to h1. He didn't necessarily have to play king to h1. His king wasn't under too much pressure. Could have even just played pawn to h4. And then queen here to h5. I think this is fine. But decided to go ahead and play pawn or king here to h1. Bishop down to h3, forcing the rook to move. Rook to e1. Bishop back here to f5. And then queen over here to b4. Now black recognizes that he's going to lose material. This queen is attacking both the pawn here on b5 and the backward pawn on d6, which we said was going to be a pain to defend the entire game. He decides to go ahead and play a bishop back here to f8. He's playing more defensive than he wants to. He wants to be aggressive, but recognizes he needs to hold on to some of his material. White continues to gobble up. Queen here to a b5. Pawn to h5, starting to push on the king side of the board, but it's just all he's doing is really pushing all of his defenders more and more in front of his king. Makes it even that more vulnerable. Knight here to e3, attacking the bishop. As you recall, White's fine just exchanging all the material on board, because that's going to be a very, very easy endgame for him. He has pawns for days over on the queen side that he can push, and he has the advantage in material as well. Bishop down h3, queen to c4, pinning down the rook. Queen back to g6, and then the pawns start to push. Pawn to a5, and then it's just going to push up the board. This rook is really holding down the fort on the 7th rank, but besides that, it's not going to be doing too much. It's very tough to hold on to all the pressure. This pawn on the b file can start to push as well. King to h8. I love the fact that Gata Kamsky is at least trying to hold on and not just resign right now, which I think a lot of players would do. Queen to h4. Bishop comes back to e6. Pawn just continues to push. Pawn to e4. Okay, solidifies this pawn on f3. Resolves. My turn. Okay, white continues. Queen to d8. King to h7, continues to push up the board. Queen to b6, and then pawn to h4. And this is one of those moves where I really don't like it. And if you look at the board, you say, well, there's not really a lot of good moves that you potentially could like. But actually disagree. I think there is a move that I like, and it is bishop takes on e3. Not because black's in a very good position, but because there's a chance. There's a chance, a very, 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 very small chance that Fabiano completely forgets how to play chess, and instead of taking with his rook on e3, he takes with his pawn on e3, and then black wins the game. Pawn to f2, there's no way to really stop this. You have the basic rook to f1. Okay, queen to f5, and we're coming down and we're going to checkmate you pretty fast. There's no way to really stop that. If we take on rook to f2, queen takes, this is all bad. There's no way to stop this. Bishop to h3. Even if the rook comes, we do see a checkmate very quickly here. If we come back and say, let's give up some material here. Let's play rook to g1. That's fine as well. Let me come back. So here, let's say, queen to b5 is an attempt, but that's not that great. Rook to g1. Now the queen comes back to f5, as we talked about. Queen to b3, trying to get involved into the action. This queen on b6, because it's blocked by the pawn on e3, is a huge pain right now, and there's no way to really get into the action. Now just queen down to f3. You can see how this gets bad. You can always, take the pawn or take the rook here on g1. You could say, well, what if instead of the queen coming down here, maybe rook to f1. Maybe this helps a little bit. Now the pawn can just take. We do see an exchange on board, and this is similar as we talked about, bishop down to h3. There's lots of variations. They all end very, very poorly for white. So that's why I really just like the chance to try to play bishop to e3. There's not a lot of huge mistakes you can make with pawn to h4. Decides to play pawn to g4. I'm not sure why white just didn't continue to push up. Just says, you keep doing your thing over on the king side of the board. I'm just going to go ahead and get a free king or free queen, or if you just want to give me your rook, that's fine as well. But decides to go ahead and play pawn to g4. Bishop takes, rook here to g1. Says, I'm going to go ahead and pin down this bishop. Can't move it. I have my knight and my rook attacking that. Now that the bishop comes down, but that's just way too little too late. Now the bishop can come down and take that, and after the bishop falls to the queen on e3, then Kamsky is forced to resign in this position. So Fabiano finally gets on the board with his first victory, and he's now moved up the leaderboard, only half a game behind the leader. So he does not have a loss at all. Kamsky, on the other hand, has 3, and he is struggling kind of halfway through this tournament. So he's going to be looking to get back on track. But all in all, exciting chess. Both players going for it with an unusual opening. We don't see that often. And Fabiano just completely outplayed his opponents today. It did not seem like a fair fight, but exciting chess nonetheless. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this round, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.